Harlem, New York. 11:23 p.m. Thursday, September 12, 1968. The air inside the back room of Rao's restaurant hung thick with cigar smoke and the residue of expensive cologne. 2 months had passed since Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's heart gave out on the sidewalk outside Wells' restaurant, and the streets were still deciding who would inherit his throne. Frank Lucas sat in a corner booth, his tailored sharkskin suit catching the amber glow of the overhead lights, the fabric stretched tight across shoulders that carried the weight of ambition and resentment in equal measure. Across from him, a Genovese capo nursed his whiskey neat, his manicured fingers drumming against the lacquered wood with the patience of a man who owned time itself. No badges visible, no tape recorders on the table, just two predators engaged in what looked like casual conversation. But the manila envelope that slid across the scarred surface told a different story. $50,000 in unmarked bills. The price tag for 23 years of loyalty that Bumpy had foolishly invested in the wrong man. Outside, the September wind carried the smell of roasted peanuts from the street vendors and diesel fumes from the buses grinding down 7th Avenue. Inside, Lucas was signing a death warrant written in his own arrogance. The Italian wanted names, roots, suppliers. He wanted the architecture of an empire that Bumpy had spent 2 decades building brick by bloody brick, protection by protection, respect by respect. And Frank Lucas, the man Bumpy had pulled from the tobacco fields of North Carolina, the man he'd taught to read a room before reading a contract, the man he'd called his prot, was about to hand it all over for the promise of partnership with men who would never see him as anything more than a useful fool. The capo leaned forward, his leather chair groaning in the calculated silence. He pushed the envelope across the wood with 2 fingers, never breaking eye contact. When he spoke, his voice carried the gravelly certainty of a man who had buried better men than Frank Lucas for far less than $50,000. He asked one question. The old man's French connection wrote. When and where? Frank Lucas did not hesitate. He did not look away. He placed his hand on the money, feeling the weight of his betrayal, and delivered the intelligence that would seal his fate. He provided dates, times, locations. He called Bumpy Johnson a ghost who had been too busy reading poetry and playing chess to see that his kingdom was already burning. It was a calculation made with arrogance, devoid of the wisdom Bumpy had tried to teach him. Lucas believed the $50,000 was a down payment on an empire. He was catastrophically wrong. 72 hours after that meeting, Lucas would discover that Bumpy Johnson's network didn't die with him. It evolved. It became something more dangerous than one man with a reputation. It became a collective memory with enforcers who remembered every lesson Bumpy taught, and the first lesson was always the same. Betrayal doesn't get buried. It gets displayed. The story of how Frank Lucas lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now, let's go back to July 1968, when Bumpy's death created the power vacuum that would consume Frank Lucas whole. July 7th, 1968. The sidewalk outside Wells' restaurant absorbed Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's final breath at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon, his heart surrendering while a half-smoked cigar remained balanced between his fingers. Within 3 hours, every numbers runner, protection collector, and street lieutenant in Harlem received the same whispered message through coded phone calls and careful knocks. The king was dead, and the empire he built through calculated violence and strategic patience went silent like a radio suddenly unplugged from its power source. The official story was medical. In Harlem, nothing about Bumpy Johnson was ever just medical. Frank Lucas stood in the back row at the funeral 5 days later, his black suit pressed sharp enough to cut glass, presenting himself as the natural successor to a throne he believed proximity had earned him. He had driven Bumpy's Cadillac for 6 years, sat in on meetings where million-dollar decisions were made with handshakes and subtle nods, watched the old man negotiate with Italian syndicates and corrupt politicians with detached precision. Lucas told anyone who would listen that he had been Bumpy's proc, his eyes and ears, his chosen successor. To him, that word meant inheritance. To everyone else, it meant errand boy with better memory than most. The old guard did not share his assessment. Men who had stood with Bumpy through the Dutch Schultz Wars moved around Frank with quiet efficiency, nodding politely but never consulting him. The real inheritors were already consolidating power through institutional knowledge and proven loyalty. Mame Johnson emerged not as a grieving widow, but as the keeper of ledgers, contact lists, and blackmail files that made the entire operation function. Red Dillard, Bumpy's financial architect who could calculate profit margins and police payoffs faster than most men used adding machines, controlled the money flows and legitimate fronts. The enforcers, men whose names never appeared in newspapers but whose reputations kept neighborhoods compliant, maintained operational security during the leadership transition. Frank Lucas was not part of these calculations. Within 48 hours of the funeral, discreet meetings began in Bumpy's old office above the pool hall on 145th Street. People disappeared for strategic sessions and returned with new clarity about territory and tribute. Mame went in regularly. Red rotated through with briefcases. Senior enforcers came and went with efficient purpose. Frank waited for his invitation. It never arrived. When he attempted to attend a transition meeting 3 days later, he was politely but firmly turned away at the door by men who had once nodded respectfully when he drove Bumpy to their locations. The exclusion was systematic, surgical. Calls about collections no longer routed through him. Drivers he used to command took orders from other voices. People who had treated him like Bumpy's shadow now acted like he was part of the scenery. The mathematics of humiliation became brutally clear. Frank had confused observation with education, proximity with inheritance rights. Every evening he drove past that office, watching shadows move behind curtained windows, feeling resentment calcify into something harder and more dangerous than disappointment. If Bumpy's people would not recognize his worth, he would find partners who understood the language of ambition and were willing to pay for the intelligence he possessed. September 10th, 1968. The dinner invitation arrived in a plain envelope slipped under his apartment door. No return address, just a restaurant name, a time, and one sentence in precise handwriting discuss opportunity that makes current arrangements look like corner store operations. Frank Lucas held that invitation for 6 minutes, understanding that accepting meant crossing lines Bumpy had taught him never to cross. Then, he put on his best suit, deciding that dead men's lessons no longer applied to living men's ambitions. Late August 1968, 8:15 in the evening. Frank Lucas crossed 12 blocks south of Harlem's boundary lines into neutral territory where Manhattan money pretended neighborhood politics did not exist. The Italian steakhouse on West 52nd Street carried the smell of aged beef and expensive tobacco, a calculated environment designed to make him feel both welcomed and out of his depth. The Genovese intermediary waited in a corner booth with strategic sightlines to both exits, his salt and pepper hair combed back with military precision that had been translated into criminal enterprise. He did not stand when Frank approached. He gestured to the seat with casual authority. The psychological seduction began before appetizers arrived. No threats materialized. No guns appeared on white tablecloths that cost more than most men earned weekly. Instead, the capo spoke about vision and wasted potential, about how certain men possessed instincts their circumstances failed to recognize. He told Frank that truly intelligent operators understood when loyalty became a liability, when tradition became an anchor dragging ambition into irrelevance. The flattery was systematic and surgical. Frank represented the future of sophisticated urban distribution networks. Bumpy's people represented nostalgia and outdated community obligations that limited profit margins. Then came the education in disrespect, delivered with the detached precision of a professor dismantling a failed hypothesis. The capo explained that Bumpy Johnson had been soft, too concerned with maintaining relationships in a business that rewarded ruthless efficiency. He called the old man outdated, someone who wasted energy on neighborhood politics and reputation management when he should have focused exclusively on maximizing revenue streams. According to this analysis, Bumpy had built an empire but lacked vision to truly capitalize on its potential. He played chess while modern operators played global economics. To Frank, whose ego had been bruised by the old guard's dismissal, these words provided intoxicating validation. Frank had already begun testing the boundaries of his own loyalty. In recent weeks, he had started skimming from collection envelopes destined for Mame Johnson. $20 here, $50 there, amounts that could be attributed to street-level shrinkage or accounting errors. Frank convinced himself this was owed compensation for years of undervalued service. The old network was fragmenting anyway. Why should he protect structures that had excluded him from their reconstruction? The escalation arrived during their third meeting, presented not as a demand but as an opportunity for Frank to demonstrate commitment to their partnership. The Italians wanted intelligence on Bumpy's most valuable remaining asset, the French Connection heroin route that moved product from Marseille through diplomatic channels into distribution networks Bumpy had spent 15 years cultivating. They wanted the Dunna of the Harlem Underworld: names, schedules, contact protocols, the architecture of an operation worth millions in annual revenue. Frank's internal justification formed with alarming ease. Bumpy was dead. The old guard had rejected his contributions. The network was fragmenting under Mame's cautious leadership and Red's conservative financial management. Why protect people who had treated him like expendable labor? Why honor loyalty to corpses and widows who could not recognize talent when it drove their Cadillacs and attended their meetings? The ultimatum arrived with the check, delivered in the same conversational tone used to discuss weather. $50,000 in cash and genuine partnership in expanding operations, or continued irrelevance while the underworld evolved around him. The capo made clear this was not negotiable. Either Frank provided actionable intelligence within 2 weeks, or their conversations ended permanently. Frank agreed before the waiter cleared their plates. As he pushed through heavy oak doors onto the cooling pavement at 10:43 that evening, he spotted a figure across the street leaning against a newsstand. Tommy Graves, one of Bumpy's old watchers. The kind of man who remembered everything and reported to people who made decisions Frank would never hear about until consequences arrived. Their eyes met for exactly 3 seconds before Tommy disappeared into the subway entrance, and Frank understood with sudden clarity that his betrayal had been observed from its inception. September 12, 1968, 11:23 in the evening. The back room of Rao's restaurant contained exactly 4 people and enough betrayal to dismantle an empire that had survived 2 decades of territorial wars and federal investigations. Frank Lucas arrived carrying intelligence that felt heavier than its physical weight suggested, the kind of burden that reshapes a man's trajectory permanently. The Genovese capo sat waiting with his whiskey-neat, manicured fingers drumming against lacquered wood with the patience of a predator who understood that wounded prey always returns to familiar patterns. The air hung thick with cigar smoke and expensive cologne mixed with something darker, the unmistakable scent of transactions that could never be undone. The systematic betrayal unfolded across 23 minutes of methodical intelligence transfer. Frank extracted 3 pages of handwritten notes from his portfolio, information compiled from memory and documents photographed during years of driving Bumpy to strategic meetings. Shipment dates spanning 6 months of French Connection operations. Warehouse locations in Red Hook and the Bronx that had never appeared on official paperwork. Most devastatingly, the names and addresses of 12 individuals who formed the operational backbone of Bumpy's distribution network. Each name represented a man who had trusted that proximity to Bumpy's driver meant Frank understood the sacred nature of operational security. The physical exchange occurred with ritualistic precision. The capo pushed a manila envelope across the scarred table surface using only 2 fingers, never breaking eye contact, establishing dominance through calculated gestures. Frank opened the envelope and began counting. $50,000 in $100 bills, 5 stacks total, each representing a piece of his soul being purchased at wholesale rates. His fingers moved through the currency with mechanical efficiency, the smell of old money filling the space between them. The capo watched with predatory satisfaction, observing the greed and desperation of a man selling his future for immediate vindication. Frank experienced a rush that flooded his nervous system like expensive heroin cutting through cheap street product. He believed in that crystalline moment that he had outsmarted everyone who had underestimated him. The old guard who had treated him like furniture. Mame Johnson who had excluded him from transition meetings. Red Dillard who had redirected his calls. Every slight, every dismissal, every moment of disrespect was being avenged through this transaction. He was no longer Bumpy's driver. He was a player making strategic moves in a game the old generation no longer controlled. The fatal mistake arrived through ego and desperate need to prove his value exceeded the asking price. Frank leaned forward, whispering that there was more information available. Unprompted, he began detailing backup communication protocols Bumpy had established for emergencies. He exposed safe houses used by Bumpy's family. He revealed political contacts who provided protection. Frank was trying to impress them, to demonstrate he was an equal partner, unaware that with every extra sentence, he was proving himself untrustworthy to everyone, even thieves. Frank departed through the back exit at 11:46, his portfolio lighter but his pockets heavier, convinced he had secured his future. He never noticed the dishwasher who had been cleaning the same plate for 20 minutes, positioned near the kitchen door with perfect acoustics to their conversation. The man's hands moved in slow circles over porcelain that was already spotless, his eyes fixed on sudsy water while his ears cataloged every word, every name, every detail of Frank's comprehensive betrayal. At exactly 11:47, the dishwasher dried his hands and walked to the payphone near the loading dock. He deposited a dime with fingers that barely trembled. When Mame Johnson answered, he spoke 3 words that would activate consequences Frank Lucas could not yet imagine. The boy talked. September 13th, 1968, 1:22 in the morning. Mame Johnson received the intelligence about Frank's betrayal in her living room, where Bumpy's chess sets remained positioned exactly as he had left them, mid-game strategies frozen in time like tactical problems waiting for solutions that would never come. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held volumes on military history and political philosophy that Bumpy had annotated in careful handwriting. His education in power translated into underlined passages and marginal notes. The dishwasher's report came through the secure line Bumpy had installed years earlier. 3 words that transformed her from grieving widow into executor of posthumous justice. She listened without interruption, her face betraying nothing while her mind processed the betrayal with cold precision her husband had spent 20 years teaching her. The widow's calculation occurred in absolute silence. Mame sat motionless for 11 minutes, hands folded in her lap, processing Frank's treachery not as emotional devastation, but as a tactical problem requiring systematic solution. Rage was inefficient. Emotion clouded judgment. Bumpy had taught her that the most devastating response to betrayal was not noise, but silence followed by methodical dismantling. She understood exactly where to apply pressure to make Frank's entire world collapse without firing a single bullet. Network activation began at 1:47 with 3 phone calls to 3 different boroughs. No shouting occurred. No dramatic speeches about loyalty or consequences. Mame spoke in measured tones, delivering quiet instructions to people who had been waiting for exactly this moment, understanding that leadership transitions always revealed hidden serpents. The first call went to Brooklyn, to a contact within the police narcotics division who owed Bumpy favors that transcended money. The second reached Queens, targeting a retired union organizer who specialized in systematic disruption. The third connected to the Bronx, to a master forger whose loyalty to Bumpy was absolute. Each conversation lasted less than 90 seconds. Each recipient understood perfectly what was required. The systematic response Mame orchestrated proved more devastating than immediate violence. Physical brutality was temporary and created martyrs. Professional humiliation and financial ruin were permanent and created cautionary tales. The first move struck at Frank's new alliance with surgical precision. By noon, the Genovese capo who had purchased Frank's intelligence received an anonymous package containing surveillance photographs and fabricated police reports suggesting Frank was actually a deeply embedded federal informant working a long-term operation. The seed of paranoid suspicion was planted with terrifying accuracy. In their world, doubt often proved more lethal than proof. The second move targeted Frank's remaining street operations with coordinated efficiency. Strategic police tips arrived at precincts covering his collection territories, not enough to trigger arrests but sufficient to create harassment and operational disruption. Competitors received intelligence about Frank's weakened position and vulnerable corners. By evening, his runners had switched allegiance to more stable operations, taking their customer bases with them. Psychological warfare commenced when Frank returned to his apartment that night. Nothing was stolen. The door showed no signs of forced entry. But everything had been moved slightly. Furniture sat inches from original positions. Books were rearranged in reverse order. Clothes hung backwards on hangers. The message was unmistakable. Privacy was illusion. Security was revocable privilege. Frank discovered the final devastation at 10:47 when he retrieved his $50,000 from its hiding place. The bills appeared identical to what he had counted at Rouse. But under closer inspection, each $100 note bore a tiny stamp in the corner, almost invisible unless you knew to look. A chess knight, Bumpy's signature piece, deployed when teaching lessons about thinking 3 moves ahead. Frank held counterfeit currency that would identify him as either fool or federal plant to anyone who examined it closely. September 15th through 22nd, 1968. Frank Lucas's world collapsed not in explosive violence, but through carefully orchestrated stages, each failure calculated to demonstrate how thoroughly he had overestimated his own importance. What he believed was a power move at Rouse revealed itself as the trigger for systematic dismantling, each day removing another layer of security he thought $50,000 had purchased. The Italian betrayal materialized first, swift and institutional. The Genovese family, convinced by fabricated surveillance reports that Frank was a federal plant running long-term infiltration, moved with paranoid efficiency to eliminate their liability. They targeted the infrastructure of his remaining operations, not with bullets, but with systematic exclusion. Street-level distributors who had taken his calls received quiet warnings that anyone associated with him carried federal heat. Warehouses he utilized experienced unexplained fires. Shipments he had already financed disappeared between Marseille and New Jersey. The capo who had flattered him days earlier now refused contact, sending word through intermediaries that further communication would be considered acts of aggression. The financial squeeze tightened with surgical precision starting September 17th. Frank maintained emergency reserves hidden across multiple locations, $3,000 concealed behind loose bricks in his cousin's basement, $7,000 buried in a Queens storage facility lockbox, $12,000 stashed in a false bottom drawer at his girlfriend's apartment. Within 72 hours, all reserves had vanished. No doors were forced. No alarms triggered. The money simply ceased to exist, replaced by empty envelopes and the terrifying realization that people he trusted were reporting to Mame Johnson. Isolation descended like suffocating fog. Former associates stopped answering calls. Dealers abandoned corners Frank controlled, migrating overnight to territories managed by Bumpy's loyal lieutenants. Suppliers who had extended credit suddenly claimed they had never heard his name. When Frank entered restaurants where he once commanded respect, conversations stopped abruptly, replaced by heavy silence that screamed exclusion. He had become contaminated inventory in a marketplace that valued survival over sentiment. Psychological pressure escalated through increasingly personal violations. Frank found a black pawn on his locked car's dashboard September 18th. His girlfriend discovered a white bishop on her bathroom counter the following morning, positioned next to her toothbrush with deliberate intimacy. Most devastatingly, his mother in North Carolina received a package containing a chess king wrapped in newspaper. Each piece carried the same silent message. Privacy was illusion. Security was revocable privilege. The realization struck Frank during a September 20th rainstorm as he stood watching water cascade down his apartment window. He was not fighting individuals seeking revenge. He was confronting an entire system Bumpy had engineered to survive its architect's death. a network of interlocking loyalties and institutional memory that operated independently of any single leader. Mame had simply activated protocols designed for exactly this scenario. Desperation drove Frank to federal offices September 21st, where he offered to become an informant against Italian operations in exchange for protection. He sat across from two agents, detailing his knowledge of distribution networks and organized crime connections. When he finished, they delivered the final insult with bureaucratic indifference. They already possessed better sources embedded deeper in relevant organizations. Frank's intelligence was outdated, his credibility compromised. They did not need his testimony. September 22nd, 4:37 in the afternoon. Frank returned to his apartment to find a cream envelope on his kitchen counter, expensive paper stock that felt like a funeral announcement. Mame Johnson's precise handwriting contained 7 words that promised resolution he could not escape. Time to settle accounts. Wells Restaurant. 7 tonight. September 25th, 1968. 7 Zode in the evening. Frank Lucas walked into Wells Restaurant, the same consecrated ground where Bumpy Johnson's heart had surrendered 3 months earlier. Understanding that locations carried weight in their world, and that choosing this address for his reckoning was strategic theater designed to remind him that. Consequences outlived the dead. The atmosphere hung heavy with ghosts and unspoken history, clatter of silverware providing background noise to his final judgment. Mame Johnson sat alone at Bumpy's favorite corner table, positioned with sight lines to both entrances, wearing elegant black that caught the amber light like judicial robes. Her composure proved more terrifying than any screaming gangster. She gestured to the empty chair with casual authority that made Frank's legs feel unstable. The confrontation began without pleasantries. Mame explained in measured tones the fundamental distinction Frank had never grasped. Bumpy had built a family, not merely a business operation. The difference mattered absolutely. Business could be negotiated, territories surrendered, money replaced. Family betrayal carried consequences that transcended death because it violated codes more sacred than contracts. Frank had confused proximity with membership, observation with initiation. He had never been family. He had been an employee who mistook access for inheritance rights, gratitude for weakness. The revelation arrived in a manila folder Mame slid across the white tablecloth with deliberate precision. Photographs documented Frank's meetings with the Genovese intermediary across multiple occasions. Clear images captured him counting $50,000 at Rao's restaurant. Surveillance reports detailed conversations he believed were private sanctuaries. The network's capabilities extended far beyond what Frank had imagined during his years driving Bumpy's Cadillac. Every meeting had been observed, documented, archived. His treachery had been allowed to fully manifest before consequences arrived, like a disease permitted to spread before surgical removal. Mame presented Frank with a choice delivered in conversational tones used to discuss weather. Disappear from New York permanently by sunrise and never invoke Bumpy's name in any context, or face what the network reserved for traitors who refused mercy. She did not elaborate on the second option. The silence that followed carried more threat than explicit description. Frank understood that men who rejected mercy simply vanished into the general violence of underworld business. The historical lesson proved most devastating. Mame revealed that Bumpy had predicted this betrayal years earlier, not specifically from Frank, but from the inevitability of ambition outpacing loyalty. He had told her that expansion always created ambitious men who confused observation with wisdom. "There's always a Judas," she said, quoting Bumpy's favorite biblical reference. Frank wasn't a mastermind. He was a cliché Bumpy had anticipated and prepared to neutralize without destroying the community. The final humiliation arrived in the same manila envelope Frank had received at Rao's. Mame returned his $50,000, explaining with clinical precision that each bill had been marked with invisible ink visible only under ultraviolet light. The marking identified the currency as belonging to a federal informant pipeline. Anyone who examined the bills closely would conclude Frank was either a snitch or catastrophically stupid. In their world, both classifications carried death sentences. His payment had become evidence of permanent contamination. Frank Lucas left New York that night. Broken spirit if not in cash, his reputation destroyed and his future in the underworld permanently compromised. He would eventually build his own heroin empire, but he would never escape this shadow. The $50,000 that was supposed to buy him a kingdom instead purchased a reputation that followed him until his 1975 arrest, when former associates lined up to testify against the man who taught them that loyalty was negotiable. The immediate fallout rippled through New York's underworld with absolute silence that spoke louder than any retaliation. The Genovese family, renowned for ruthless efficiency, found itself paralyzed by a counter-offensive that had dismantled an entire operation in 24 hours. The response wasn't violence, it was damage control wrapped in humiliation. 3 days after the bodies were discovered outside Sylvia's restaurant, Tony Bender-Strollo requested a meeting through neutral intermediaries, understanding that his organization had crossed a line that demanded immediate diplomatic resolution. The meeting occurred in a Harlem barbershop on 125th Street, lasting exactly 7 minutes and representing the complete inversion of traditional power dynamics. Strollo arrived without bodyguards, carrying an envelope containing $50,000 in reparations for the disrespect. He placed the money on the table between them, a gesture that acknowledged fault while attempting to purchase forgiveness. Bumpy didn't touch the envelope. He didn't even look at it. He accepted nothing except a verbal promise that the boundaries of Harlem were now absolute, and that no Italian family would ever again consider his family legitimate targets for intimidation. Strollo left with his money but without his dignity, understanding that the hierarchy of organized crime had fundamentally shifted. In Harlem streets, the story of the 24-hour purge transmuted instantly from news into mythology. Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a respected gangster. He had become a force of nature who could erase bloodlines before sunset. The narrative spread through every borough, retold in social clubs and barbershops with details that grew more elaborate with each telling. New recruits in every crime family heard the tale as cautionary instruction about boundaries that couldn't be crossed regardless of organizational backing or racial assumptions. The photographs that were meant to demonstrate vulnerability instead became symbols of catastrophic miscalculation, teaching young soldiers that threatening Bumpy Johnson's family wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. The personal cost to Bumpy remained invisible to everyone except those closest to him. His wife Mame later recalled weeks of sleepless nights where he sat at their kitchen table drinking coffee until dawn, processing the weight of 8 lives ended because someone photographed his grandson playing stickball. His philosophy had always been that violence served strategic purpose, that brutality without objective was weakness disguised as strength. He didn't want this systematic elimination, didn't celebrate the destruction of men following orders from superiors. But his world operated on immutable logic. Weakness invited aggression, and aggression against family required disproportionate response that prevented future violations. The protection this act provided lasted the remainder of his life. For the next decade until his death in 1968, no one dared threaten Bumpy Johnson's family again. The Italians maintained respectful distance, treating Harlem as sovereign territory rather than subordinate operation. Police who had previously considered him a vulnerable target suddenly gave him operational space, understanding that pushing too hard against a man willing to eliminate 8 people in 24 hours created more problems than it solved. His family moved through New York with invisible security purchased through institutional memory and absolute fear-based respect. Historically, this event represents a turning point in Black organized crime's relationship with Italian syndicates, proving definitively that respect was non-negotiable regardless of race. The photographs that Torino commissioned to expose vulnerability had achieved the exact opposite, illuminating the terrifying depth of Bumpy's network and the absolute finality of his judgment. 8 men participated in threatening Bumpy Johnson's family. 8 men learned that in the underworld there are rules older than law, codes more binding than blood, and consequences more severe than prison. Bumpy Johnson didn't just eliminate his enemies, he erased them so completely that their names became warnings whispered in social clubs from Harlem to Little Italy. 24 hours. 8 lives. One message that echoed through organized crime history: never touch the family.